In January 2025, the administration in Washington issued a public trade ultimatum directed at Canada, threatening a 25% tariff on every single product entering the United States from its northern neighbor. This was not a quiet diplomatic signal or a speculative background briefing. It was a declared economic threat described repeatedly as a corrective measure against what was framed as an economic drain. The rhetoric escalated beyond trade policy into the realm of sovereignty itself, with repeated suggestions that Canada should simply surrender its independence and become the 51st state. The underlying message was unmistakably clear. Compliance was the only acceptable posture, and the price of any deviation would be severe economic pain delivered through the blunt instrument of border taxation. What actually unfolded in the weeks that followed defied the expected script of a smaller economy buckling under pressure from a vastly larger one. There was no immediate capitulation and no retreat into a posture of defensive negotiation rooted in fear. The response from Ottawa was not a desperate plea for exemptions, but a strategic pivot of significant consequence. The newly installed leadership convened a series of closed-door sessions with senior economic advisors, and the instruction that emerged from those meetings was remarkably direct in its clarity and its ambition. The mandate was to identify new economic partners to accelerate those relationships with urgency, and to ensure that any new arrangements were not merely symbolic gestures or photo opportunities, but were instead structural and legally binding frameworks designed for long-term durability. Within an exceptionally short period of time, the most aggressive and focused trade diversification effort in modern Canadian history was fully mobilized. The first major industrial power to respond with a substantive and reciprocal strategic embrace was not found across the Atlantic in Europe, nor in the traditional markets of Japan or the United Kingdom. It was South Korea that stepped forward with the institutional capacity and the industrial hunger to match Canada's new trajectory. What Canada and South Korea are currently constructing together defies the simplistic characterization of a routine trade agreement. It is not a courtesy memorandum of understanding destined to gather dust on a shelf. It represents a systematic sector-by-sector effort to erect an alternative economic architecture specifically engineered to reduce structural dependence on the American market. This is not merely a diversification of customers. It is a recalibration of supply chain ownership and resource sovereignty. To understand the full dimensions of this shift, one must look past the surface-level trade statistics and into the specific mineralogical and industrial realities that make this alignment not only possible, but profoundly necessary for both nations. The majority of the initial coverage missed the central thesis of this story entirely. This is not fundamentally a narrative about tariffs or export volumes. It is a story about supply chain sovereignty in an era defined by the electrification of the global economy. Once the specific asset that Canada possesses and the specific vulnerability that South Korea urgently needs to address are brought into focus, the entire strategic picture resolves with a sharpness that renders the early reporting on this matter incomplete by several analytical layers. Canada stands as one of the most mineral-wealthy nations on the face of the earth. This is not wealth measured in conventional terms of fiscal surplus or gross domestic product ratios. This is a specific industrial wealth rooted in the geology of the 21st century. Canada holds world-leading reserves of cobalt, lithium, nickel, and a suite of rare earth elements that are not obscure or niche commodities. They are the foundational chemical and metallic inputs required for every single electric vehicle battery currently manufactured at commercial scale anywhere on the planet. The relationship between these minerals and the energy transition is absolute and non-negotiable. Without a secure supply of cobalt, there is no high-density battery chemistry. Without nickel and lithium, the energy density and longevity required for modern electric vehicles simply cannot be achieved. It is a direct and unbreakable linkage. At present, Canadian extraction supplies approximately 40% of the cobalt that flows into North American electric vehicle battery production. That figure represents not a minor vendor relationship, but a structural choke point that runs in two directions. The industrial base of the United States requires Canadian minerals to realize its stated goals of electrification, yet for decades Canada has largely channeled the overwhelming majority of those critical minerals through supply chains that ultimately terminate within American corporate and industrial infrastructure. In essence, Canada has been sitting on a mountain of economic leverage that it has historically chosen not to wield with any degree of strategic aggression. That calculus changed dramatically in the winter of 2025. The individual directing this pivot brings a background uniquely suited to the task of re-engineering national economic dependencies. He is not a product of the conventional political class or a lifelong creature of campaign trails and partisan caucuses. His career was forged in the rarefied and rigorously analytical world of central banking, having served as the governor of two of the most significant financial institutions in the world. Consequently, his instincts are not calibrated toward short-term political advantage or rhetorical flourish. They are geared toward the assessment of systemic risk and the construction of durable long-term architecture. When the tariff threats arrived, the response was not a hastily arranged press conference laden with emotional language or retaliatory bombast. The response was a strategic directive issued internally and signaled externally with deliberate precision. In February of 2025, a statement was issued that many media outlets initially parsed as a routine nod toward the concept of trade diversification. It was the kind of diplomatic language often deployed by leaders seeking to project independence without incurring the costs of actually exercising it. Yet a closer reading of the full text reveals something far more substantive. It was less a pleasantry and more a declaration of changing operational assumptions. The statement articulated in plain terms that the era of presumptive automatic alignment with Washington's economic posture had entered a new and more complicated phase. It signaled that future partnerships would be evaluated and pursued based on a calculus of strategic interest rather than simple geographic proximity. Such a sentiment, articulated aloud by a sitting Canadian leader, represents a significant departure from decades of careful diplomatic ambiguity. It was not accidental. It was a message transmitted with a specific audience in mind. That audience was listening carefully in Seoul. To grasp why South Korea moved with such alacrity, one must understand the specific and acute industrial crisis currently confronting the Korean Peninsula's economic engine. South Korea is home to three of the most dominant and technologically advanced electric vehicle battery manufacturers on the global stage. Together, these industrial conglomerates command approximately 30% of the global market share for battery production, in a sector projected to be worth trillions within the coming decade. These are not small enterprises operating in niche segments. They are industrial titans whose entire business model and future growth trajectory hinge on a single non-negotiable variable. They require a stable, reliable, and geopolitically secure supply of the raw materials that constitute the literal building blocks of every cell they produce. For years, South Korea's battery industry has been navigating a profound and uncomfortable vulnerability. The dominant source of processed battery materials, particularly for lithium and cobalt, has been the People's Republic of China. The depth of this dependence created a strategic exposure that was widely acknowledged in boardrooms and government ministries across Seoul. In the event of export restrictions, a tool Beijing has demonstrated a willingness to deploy across various sectors and contexts. South Korea's battery sector would face an existential crisis with no rapid or easy solution. There is no expedited mechanism to replace a supply chain that required decades of capital investment and political alignment to establish. Consequently, South Korean industrial planners and state-affiliated financial institutions have been actively scouring the globe for alternative sources of supply that meet a stringent set of criteria. The source must be politically stable and anchored in a rule of law jurisdiction. It must be geographically accessible to maritime logistics networks. It must be aligned with, or at least not antagonistic toward, the broader alliance structures in which South Korea operates. And crucially, it must be large enough to provide industrial scale volumes that actually move the needle on a 30% global market share. The search kept resolving on a singular and compelling answer. Canada possesses the geology. It possesses the political stability and transparency demanded by institutional investors. It is a member of the G7 and operates within a shared intelligence framework that reassures security planners in Seoul. And as of early 2025, Canada presented something it had not previously offered with such clarity. It had a government that was actively, openly, and urgently seeking precisely the kind of deep structural partnership that South Korea was desperate to offer. From the perspective of Seoul, the timing was almost perfectly synchronized. The specific corporate maneuvers currently underway provide a more accurate picture of the future than any diplomatic communique could. A major South Korean conglomerate with deep roots in advanced materials and a significant footprint in the global battery material supply chain has been aggressively expanding its operational presence in North America, with a distinct emphasis on Canadian mineral extraction and processing assets. This is not a minor actor conducting exploratory due diligence. It is a firm with the industrial heft and the governmental backing to transition from negotiation to operational reality at a velocity that frequently outstrips the bureaucratic processes of Western competitors. Discussions are underway involving other major South Korean battery manufacturers regarding specific sourcing agreements tied to Canadian mineral output. These are not abstract conversations about future potential. They are negotiations structured around specific tonnage commitments, defined processing and refining arrangements, and concrete investment timelines. The fact that these discussions are being facilitated at the highest levels of the Canadian government underscores the seriousness with which Ottawa is treating this strategic pivot. The current bilateral trade relationship between Canada and South Korea is valued at approximately 14 billion Canadian dollars annually, placing South Korea as a key trading partner in the Asia-Pacific region. That figure, however, is almost certain to appear quaint and outdated within a relatively short time frame if the current frameworks evolve into multi-decade supply contracts. The investment required in the Canadian critical mineral sector alone to meet the projected surge in global electric vehicle demand is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars over the next decade. This represents a generational economic opportunity, and South Korea has positioned itself to capture a significant and enduring share of that value stream. Yet the narrative becomes significantly more intricate upon deeper examination, and this is the layer of complexity that much of the initial wave of coverage failed to adequately address. South Korea is not a neutral commercial actor operating in a geopolitical vacuum where only supply and demand curves matter. South Korea is a formal treaty ally of the United States with a mutual defense arrangement that has anchored security on the Korean peninsula for over 70 years. American military personnel are stationed on Korean soil, and the extended deterrence provided by Washington underwrites the entire security architecture of the region. The alliance remains the cornerstone of South Korea's strategic posture against existential threats from the north. This reality coexists with the fact that South Korean corporations, with the tacit understanding and quiet facilitation of their own government, are constructing economic infrastructure inside Canada that directly competes with the supply chain primacy that Washington has sought to maintain. This creates a profound tension that has yet to be fully articulated in public discourse. It raises a specific and uncomfortable question about the limits of alliance management. What precisely is the United States prepared to do in response to an ally diversifying its critical supply chains away from American dependence and toward a third-party partner? The traditional toolkit of economic statecraft is largely inapplicable in this scenario. One cannot levy sanctions against a mutual defense ally. One cannot invoke trade retaliation against a partner whose cooperation is essential on matters ranging from semiconductor export controls to the management of strategic competition with China. The options available to Washington regarding South Korea's deepening economic integration with Canada are far more constrained than the bluster of tariff threats might imply. There is a historical parallel that provides a useful framework for understanding the likely trajectory of this realignment. Several decades ago, an advanced industrial economy in Asia faced a catastrophic supply shock that exposed the complete vulnerability of its manufacturing base to a single disrupted source of energy. The response from that nation's leadership was not a reactive panic. It was a methodical long-term strategy of diversification. That nation systematically spread its sourcing across multiple geographies, regardless of whether every individual investment aligned perfectly with the preferences of its primary security guarantor. The decision was made that supply chain sovereignty was a national interest that outweighed the occasional diplomatic friction generated by independent action. That strategic choice reshaped the structure of economic relationships across an entire hemisphere for the next half-century. South Korea appears to be applying that same hard-won strategic lesson not to the supply of petroleum, but to the supply of the critical minerals that will power the next half-century of industrial production. And Canada, rather than being a passive recipient of this investment flow, is an active and willing architect of this repositioning. This brings us to the complex legal and geopolitical subtext that will define the next 12 months. There are specific provisions embedded within the Continental Trade Agreement that replace the older North American framework that Canadian trade lawyers are now scrutinizing with considerable interest. There is a particular South Korean corporate entity in this narrative whose historical and ongoing relationships with Chinese supply networks add a layer of nuance to the story of a clean alternative to Beijing's dominance. And there are three distinct scenarios for how this repositioning is likely to unfold over the coming year, one of which is considerably more disruptive to Washington's strategic position than the tariff threat it was originally designed to prevent. The legal provision under review pertains to the trade pact governing commerce between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The agreement contains specific obligations and rules of origin, designed in part to prevent Canada from becoming a conduit for non-member nations to access the American market on favorable terms. The concern from Washington's perspective is straightforward. If South Korean companies establish deep processing and manufacturing infrastructure within Canadian borders, and the output of those facilities qualifies for preferential access to the United States market under the terms of the Continental Agreement, Washington ends up absorbing the economic and strategic consequences of a partnership it did not negotiate and over which it has limited direct control. This is not a theoretical exercise. American trade officials have voiced similar concerns in other contexts, notably regarding the flow of components through manufacturing facilities in other allied nations and their subsequent entry into the American market. Canadian legal experts are currently examining whether the mineral processing partnerships being structured with South Korea might eventually trigger the same level of scrutiny. The answer based on the current text of the agreement is genuinely ambiguous, and that ambiguity itself is strategically significant. It suggests that Washington's legal standing to formally object to what Canada and South Korea are building is considerably weaker than any political objection might imply. Canada is not violating the letter of its trade commitments. It is operating precisely within the existing architecture while simultaneously constructing new relationships that the original architects of that agreement never specifically contemplated. This is not a breach of contract. It is the execution of sophisticated and careful trade policy. Turning to the South Korean industrial giant at the center of this story, its profile complicates the simplistic narrative of a clean decoupling from Chinese influence. This corporation is a titan of advanced materials and one of the most aggressive players in the global battery supply chain. It also maintains active joint ventures and materials sourcing relationships with Chinese firms. These are not vestigial connections from a bygone era that are being slowly unwound. They are ongoing commercial relationships that reflect the reality of how deeply integrated South Korean industrial networks became with Chinese supply chains during the era when that integration was economically rational and politically tolerated. This corporation is not a proxy for Beijing. It remains a firmly South Korean entity, but its materials infrastructure is not hermetically sealed from Chinese industrial networks. What this means for Canada is not that the partnership is illegitimate or carries undue risk. It means that the narrative of South Korean investment serving as a pristine and fully decoupled alternative to Chinese influence is more textured than the headline version suggests. Canada is not simply swapping one monolithic partner for another. It is engaging with industrial actors who are themselves navigating their own complex and interdependent relationships with Beijing. This adds a layer of strategic complexity that Ottawa's policymakers are aware of and actively managing behind closed doors. It does not invalidate the logic of the partnership, but it does underscore the necessity for careful structural oversight. Looking ahead, there are three plausible scenarios for how this strategic realignment will evolve. The first scenario is one of deepening integration and formalization. Canada and South Korea finalize long-term binding mineral supply contracts and joint processing agreements. South Korean battery manufacturers secure a stable and politically insulated supply chain for the minerals that underpin their global market dominance. Canada secures the capital investment required to unlock its vast mineral endowment, along with the strategic leverage that comes from being an indispensable supplier to a major industrial power. This scenario is not only plausible, it is already partially in motion, and it represents the stated objective of both governments. Under this trajectory, the Canada-South Korea relationship becomes a permanent structural fixture of the global critical minerals economy, not a temporary response to a transient tariff threat. The second scenario involves a concerted effort at pressure or retaliation from Washington. The American administration recognizes the long-term implications of what is being constructed, decides that the shift in supply chain control is unacceptable and begins to apply a mix of diplomatic and economic pressure on both Ottawa and Seoul to slow or redirect the partnership. This pressure could manifest through the dispute resolution mechanisms of the Continental Trade Agreement. It could take the form of bilateral pressure on the security relationship with South Korea, subtle or overt signals that the American defense umbrella carries with it certain expectations regarding economic alignment. Alternatively, and perhaps most productively from a North American perspective, Washington could respond by making a competing and more attractive offer to Canada. It could match or exceed the capital and commitment being offered by South Korea, thereby pulling Canadian minerals back into an integrated continental supply chain. This third form of American response would represent the kind of proactive industrial policy that many observers had argued was necessary years before the tariff threats alienated Canada and accelerated the search for alternatives. The pressure from Washington may have inadvertently forced a long overdue strategic conversation within American industrial planning circles about the true value of Canadian resources. The third scenario is one of South Korean retrenchment. Faced with sustained and credible pressure, particularly pressure that implicates the security guarantee on the Korean peninsula, the government in Seoul could conclude that the diplomatic cost of the Canadian partnership exceeds the supply chain benefit and pull back from the deeper integration frameworks. While this scenario appears the least likely in the immediate near term, it is not an impossibility. The domestic political situation in South Korea remains fluid, and a new administration navigating a complex and occasionally volatile relationship with Washington might calculate that a visible display of economic independence is a luxury it cannot currently afford given the security threats it faces. The most probable trajectory lies somewhere between the first and second scenarios. Integration will deepen, but it will likely proceed with a degree of deliberate ambiguity in public communications. Both Ottawa and Seoul have an interest in allowing Washington the option of not turning this into a public confrontation, while quietly building the legal and commercial foundations for a future where Canadian minerals flow increasingly toward Asian battery plants rather than American ones. The fundamental takeaway from this entire sequence of events is one of unintended consequences. The threat of a 25% tariff was intended to extract compliance and demonstrate the weight of American economic power. What it delivered instead was a catalyst for a structural realignment that will be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse with every new contract signed and every new processing facility brought online. The quiet, assumed, and largely unexamined dominance over the economic future of its northern neighbor that the United States has enjoyed for generations was never guaranteed by geography or by sentiment. It was guaranteed by the absence of viable alternatives. South Korea just established itself as a viable alternative. Once that door has been opened, it is not the kind of door that closes easily or quietly. The situation was not created by the current leadership in Ottawa. It was presented to them by the actions emanating from Washington. South Korea simply recognized the strategic opening and walked through it.